Educators Lead, episode 124.
What do they need to hear? How can I say this in a way that they can hear my message? Because it's so easy to assume that people are hearing or understanding your communication in the same way as you're intending it. You have to change the message.
Welcome to Educators Lead, where we interview leaders in education to offer inspiration and practical advice to help launch educators into the next level of leadership. I'm your host, Jay Willis, and I want to thank you for subscribing to our show.
This is John Lee Dumas of EO Fire, and you're listening to Educators Lead. Let's join my friend Jay Willis and get ready to take your leadership to the next level.
Hello, EduLeaders. Jay Willis here, and I'm excited to introduce our featured guest today, Beth Russell. Beth, are you ready?
I am.
All right, Beth Russell has been in education for 28 years. Prior to entering education, Beth was a social worker serving children who suffered from emotional and behavioral challenges in treatment foster care. Beth's path in education began as a school social worker, where she then decided to use her social work skills as a tongue twister in a different way and become a school administrator. Beth earned her doctorate and principal's license at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. So that's just a brief introduction, Beth, but tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I'm married. I have 3 children and 2 grandchildren. My kids live in San Francisco and New York City, and I'm in the middle of the country, so wow. They're great places to visit. And some other things that I do in my spare time is I love art quilting, traveling, reading, biking, anything to do with the outdoors. I love that. Lots of hiking. Both in Colorado, where we have a little cabin, and, anytime we can hike in our travels, we do it.
Well, so we were chatting before we actually started recording, and you were mentioning that you had just gotten back from a trip. So can you share a little bit about that trip with us?
Yeah. Well, we went to New Zealand and Australia, and it was fabulous. And we did a lot of hiking. I also followed up on a second cousin and found 2 second cousins in the North Island of New Zealand, and just had a wonderful time connecting and learning more about my family. So it was a great trip, really great.
Yeah, that sounds like it'd be a lot of fun. So for people who may not be familiar with your story, if you don't mind, maybe start from the beginning and talk about how you got to where you are today. Maybe even, once you graduated from college to today.
Okay. Well, I graduated from college and went and worked on a dude ranch in Colorado.
Oh, wow.
And it was there that, from there I worked in Colorado Springs in a group home for kids that were awaiting adjudication, and also in a mental health center. But really wanted to travel and see the world. And I had been involved in Young Life and met a man at this dude ranch who ran the international program. And anyway, I ended up in Paris and lived there for 2 years, working with kids in clubs and camps, and pretty much, in the Alps and southern part of France. And then came back and went to work in working with police and probation, kids that got arrested for drugs and alcohol in the town where I grew up in Illinois. And it was there that a man who was my boss and mentor said, "You got to go to graduate school." So I went to graduate school in Minneapolis, Minnesota, for my master's in social work. And from there, worked in treatment foster care with kids that had emotional and behavior challenges. I had gotten married and was pregnant, and I had a call about I don't know, midnight to come out to this foster home. And this kid was really violent and throwing things. And here I am pregnant. And I'm thinking, I have got to switch jobs. This is a little dangerous, and you get into that protective mode. So then I started looking at school social worker, and I really wondered if I would be bored if I was in a school, because in, the types of settings I had worked with, every day was a challenge, and you never knew what to expect from the kids. But I had a friend that I'd gone to graduate school with, and he saw my name, and so he said, we should interview her. And because they were at that point just looking at people with experience in schools. But he got me in the door, and I started in school social work, working with kids on IEPs, individual education plans. And, that's kind of, from there, I had a student who I had worked with in group and individual work in the schools, and she accused a teacher of sexually assaulting her on a trip. And, anyway, it wasn't true, but the administration basically let this teacher go. And not to go into all the details, it was one of those moments where, to not sound arrogant, but it's one of those moments that I just thought, oh my gosh, I could have made a better decision. This decision affected this teacher's life. I knew because I was working with the student that it wasn't true. There was a lot of complications in that, and I won't go into it, but at any rate, that's when I started taking classes to become a school administrator. And I thought with the social work background, it would be fabulous. And so I took classes for about, I was married and had 2 small kids at this time. And I have a stepdaughter. She was a little older, but she was like 12, 13. And so it was a busy time. And I just took my time and decided to get the doctorate because it was a matter of a couple more classes and then writing the dissertation. And I just thought, people just said, if it's a question between you and another person and one has a doctorate and the other one doesn't, they may go with the person with the higher degree. So I chose to pursue that. And did my internship at the school where I was working. I was the administrator working primarily with special ed kids, and had a great mentor there, the assistant principal, and then moved on to my first job, which was an assistant principal in another district. But that's kind of how I got in the job. I say I came into education through the back door, and I had to learn a lot. And part of that's why I got my doctorate in education, because I hadn't been formally trained as a teacher. And I had a great opportunity as a social worker. Actually, I taught a class of service learning with another teacher with regular ed kids and special ed kids. And I also taught an EBD program, kids and social skills. So I had classroom experience, but not through the traditional way at all. And so I had to really work hard at getting that knowledge and feeling like I knew what I was talking about and take on those experiences when they came. And I had a wonderful principal that I worked with in my first job who was an instructional leader, highly skilled, trained under Madeline Hunter. And he taught me a lot. We're still in contact. I still work with him on some projects, and, it was a great turning point for me.
Yeah. So your first role in leadership then was assistant principal, you said?
Yes. Yeah.
And then how long were you there? And then what was the next step?
So I was an assistant principal in this district for 4 years. And then I moved to principal in a small district, and where I was really principal, assistant principal, social worker. It was a really small district. The high school, the middle school, and the superintendent's office were all in one building. And then they had one other elementary school. But it was a great place to really learn the role. And then I was there only 2 years. And then I moved to an urban Minneapolis and was there 7-8 years as principal of a middle school in the city. And then from there, I moved to the district where I was originally the assistant principal. I went back to the school as principal and retired from there. In between, in Minneapolis, I also had a different role, principal and then a director of the Institute for Learning in Minneapolis. So, but then I retired as principal back in a building. And now I work with a local university, working with principals, teachers, actually, who are trying to become principals, and I supervise their internship. So I think that's my role.
Yeah. Well, so what were some of the biggest struggles you encountered? I know you had small kids at home, and, as you were kind of along the journey to becoming a school administrator, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced?
I think juggling it all. I think when I became an assistant principal, I was still working on my dissertation, and I did have my license then. I think that was probably the most challenging, is finishing up the doctorate. Back when I got my license, you could only get your license either as an elementary principal or as a secondary principal. So I didn't have the challenges people have today, where you're getting a K-12 license and you need to find time to go to another building or 2 different buildings or different districts to get that experience, those experience hours. I worked in a middle school and got all my hours in the middle school for the secondary license, and did not get an elementary license. So I don't know if that's the same across the country, but at least in Minnesota, it's a K-12 license now. So I think finding time in juggling, small children classes, I guess the advice is, I took a class, I just plodded along, took a class in the summer, and a class here and there, during the year, but I didn't overdo it. It took me 7 years to finish the classes.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So what would you say, once you had that first position in school leadership, what were some of the biggest challenges you faced once you actually got into that role?
I think one of the biggest challenges and rude awakenings, quite frankly, was the us-them mentality. I had not changed. I was still, in my head, I was still, I'm here for the kids and like my colleagues. And when I became an assistant principal, now granted, it was in a different district, so people didn't know me, but I can say that I think this just happens, is you move into that leadership role, and there's already that distance between you as the leader, principal, and staff. And a primary example of that is, I was in charge of the schedule and grades and that kind of thing as an assistant principal. And we had back then when first started out, the systems weren't as well functioning as they are today. And so I said to people, the system's up and running. You can put in your grades if you want. Well, grades weren't due for another week. And everybody just was like, what? We have to put in grades? What are we doing? And I went to my principal. I said, my gosh, what is the uproar about? I just said that they could if they wanted to. It was up and running. And he said, you are in this position. You have to think of your positional role. What they heard was the assistant principal said, you can put in grades. They didn't hear colleague to colleague, hey, the grade thing is open, you can put them in. And it was this perception of how it was communicated from my positional power or role that was a real rude awakening, and something I took forward in terms of understanding that when I spoke from that role, not in the same way as I had as a colleague, if that makes any sense.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, because, a subtle mentioning something can be done when you're just a peer, like the example you gave. Suddenly when you mention it as a leader, it sounds like an indirect request, right?
Right.
Where you're indirectly saying, well, you can do this now. So it's like saying, do this now, right?
Right. I think that was one of the challenges all throughout being a principal, is just how do you develop a culture and a community where people see their role is valued no matter what it is, and that we are all basically working together for the benefit of kids. Even though I knew that from a hierarchical standpoint, I was the leader of the school, but how do you empower others to take on that leadership and ownership and be able to communicate their ideas or their differences in a collaborative fashion, even with you as the principal. So it wasn't this top-down thing. And that, I would say, was probably a challenge throughout. There were some schools that I was in that happened and it was natural, and people were willing to assume that, and others that it took a lot more work to develop that kind of collaborative spirit in the building.
Well, so how did you overcome some of those challenges? I mean, obviously, in the path to becoming a school administrator, there had to be some times where you just think, man, this is just taking forever to do this. And, to stay dedicated and focused and continue to keep your eyes on the goal, what are some things that, I guess, helped you overcome some of the challenges that you faced?
Well, I think one thing was having a collegial group. So when I was in a large district, we had a large number of principals and assistant principals, and it was a wonderful support network of other leaders, so that you could call not only your boss, but you could call other people and say, hey, what would you do in this situation? So that was key. When I moved to a smaller district, there weren't as many colleagues, and you were also doing not only building work, you were doing district work. So I joined a collegial network of principals. We met once a month, and then I tapped into my former principals and organized, for us to meet monthly as well. Obviously, phone calls with other leaders too help, but just building in, I think you have to build in that network of support, because you are, besides you and your assistant principal, you are it's a lonely job. And, I felt strongly that, I had to keep that distinction a little bit. Because you know more. You can't share stuff with staff, all the time. There's a lot of things you can't share. And so you just need to be able to process that with other people that are in like roles. So that was key in giving that support.
Yeah, that's great advice, because I imagine that, people, you've heard the expression, I'm sure, it's lonely at the top, and the higher you go up in leadership, there's fewer other peers up there with you. And so I think what's great about what you just said there is, staying connected to other people who are in similar roles, so that you can kind of bounce ideas off them and get advice and not feel like you're the only person there kind of on an island, right?
Right. And also you have to, when I came in to my last job, I sent out a message to all staff that I would love to talk with them, hear about what they feel the issues are that the school could improve on, things that are great, what their own personal concerns. And I had probably 3/4 of the staff come in over the summer. And one of the things I learned was that they felt that the office environment was kind of cliquey, and that there were favorites and that kind of thing. And so I quickly also, that probably was the most prominent time that I realized, I can never project an idea that I have favorites, even though there were people in that building who I was friends with from outside the district. I had to really work hard at making sure that was neutral. So I never, I wasn't on Facebook with anybody, and I told this one friend that I had from outside the district and happened to work in the same building, take me off of your Facebook because I don't want to be connected with anyone. Social media. I just kept those boundaries because I didn't want that kind of perception going on. I felt like you have to be really neutral and fair, obviously, with all staff. So.
Now, did that create any stress with those friendships, or were they understanding?
No, I mean, actually, it was one friend when I took the job, and she said I was harder on her than anyone else, and I said, I don't feel like I'm harder on you. I just can say it directly and not worry about how it's being said. So no, and I actually told my leadership team when I started, I am friends with this person, and if you ever see me acting unfairly, then you need to call me on it. But this person wasn't in a traditional teacher role either, so it was a little easier. But I mean, that's going to happen, and I think people, especially if people are leaders in buildings in which they have worked as colleagues, I think that is a real challenge for people. And some people can make that transition, and other people, it's too hard to then become the boss of people that you were colleagues with before. So I think that's a thing to always consider when making that next move is, can I separate that and still honor and keep the friendship? Because that is important.
Yeah, I could see that. A lot of people refer to moving from the classroom to school leadership as like going to the dark side, right? And so I can imagine that sometimes that would be challenging. And I know that just in talking to other leaders, that sometimes it can be just an interesting transition going from being a peer and friends with people, other teachers and other people in the classroom, to then becoming their leader, and how sometimes that can just be awkward, as you transition into that new role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. We had a teacher who just became an administrator, and he's still in the same district, but he switched buildings, and I think that's been really good for him because the buildings each have their own personality too. So, and he recognized that. So.
Well, you had mentioned earlier in the conversation that you had gone from, I think, kind of a small rural school, or at least a smaller school where you wore a lot of hats, to an urban school. So talk to us about that transition. What was that like, and how did you kind of adapt? Because I have to imagine that it's quite a culture difference.
Yeah, it was a difference. Yeah, the smaller suburban setting was a lot more conservative, a lot more primarily Caucasian. It was more, how do you say it? Well, it was most people had the same values, and it was, it was a great little district to learn from. And when I went into the urban setting, it was very diverse. We had probably 70% students of color and 30% white, and our free and reduced lunch population was, up there as well. And it changed over the course of the years that I was there as well. But I think the biggest challenge was all the fights that were going on. And, right in the hallways. And the building was such that it was hard to see. It was in a circle pattern, the building. So it was hard to see around the corner. So basically, what I had to do, I worked with my police liaison officer, which was a new thing too. They were in the building 100% of the time. And I just said we were going to charge people with assault if they got into fights. And just stating that, the fights dropped like 50% because people don't want to be arrested, but it was setting down. I had to be a lot more authoritarian initially, which is not my style. But I had to set really clear boundaries. And I think the biggest challenge, I'll never forget, with one of my first times there, I had a student who had been in a fight or something. Anyway, the mother came in, was talking to her, and the daughter said that I grabbed her, and I said I didn't. And the mother was angry, and it was a person of color, and my security person was there, and she thought the mother was going to hit me, and so she's there to protect me. And I felt like she was accusing me because, I was new there, and I was white, and I think there was a sense you don't get it. And so my security person really intervened on my behalf, and we calmed down the situation and went on. Anyway, I pulled my security person in and I said, how do you do it? How do you do it? I felt like she didn't like me just because I'm white. I mean, I felt this overt, kind of distrust. And she said to me, every day, I and the chocolate chip and the oatmeal cookie, and today you were the marshmallow and the hot chocolate. And, it just eased the tension. And she said, you can't let it get you down. You have to just keep doing what you're doing. And it took that first year for the word to get out that I was fair, and that I was not, that I was fair, and that I held all kids accountable, and that the bottom lines were for safety and security. And so much so that it flipped. But, at the end, I remember a mother coming in and telling me that if I wanted to, I could hang her kid up by his toes and wallop him one. And I just looked at the student, and this was a family that spoke a different language. And I just said to the student, your mother's giving me some great ideas. And the student just kind of, looked at me. But I think that was a good example for me, is the trust that I had to work at it, getting in the community, that people knew that, the purpose of setting bottom lines or being communicative or in this way was because I cared about their kids getting an education, and it wasn't going to happen if people were out in the hallways, So I don't know if that answers your question, but that is probably the most poignant change that I recall, moving from one school to the next.
Well, and so you've been in school administration for a while, and I'm sure you just have some amazing stories to share of the impact that you've been able to witness and to be a part of. But what's been your best or one of your best moments as a school administrator?
Well, that's a hard one to answer. As I thought about it, I think for me personally, when I've been able to empower kids or staff, and you see the light in their eyes, as Sonia Nieto says, you see the light in their eyes, the kids and the learning and the staff and in what they've accomplished. I think the hardest part about being administrator is no success is really your own, if you're quite honest about it. It's about the people, the teachers in the classroom and what they're doing with kids every day. And my job is to empower them and to support them and hold them accountable to that work in the classroom. And by working with people to see that happen and seeing the impact on kids, that has been the best thing for me, because I see always that potential of being better and better and better and better. And that's probably a plus and a minus in my favor, because I always wanted to keep providing those opportunities. And I think that the professional development that we've brought in to really help people think and reflect about their practice and continue to grow. There's many times that the experiences that we've had through that have been amazing. And then to see teachers take that and to enact it in their classroom. So what was your original question?
No, that was a great response. It was just about the impact you've been able to have be a part of as a school administrator. But that did actually bring up, so tell us more about kind of what you're involved with now.
Well, I'm working with a university here that I work with. They're mostly teachers, some coaches, some, teachers in the classroom, coaches, union people that are wanting to become licensed as principals and move into a formal leadership role. So I go and observe them. I work with them in a class setting as well, and we process their internship experiences. They're working with an on-site supervisor that is a current acting principal. And, it's very rewarding. It's also, they journal, they write, and I provide perspective on that. Pretty much asking questions to push the thinking. I think the one of the biggest compliments I received, and I've received it a couple times over my career, but was that the compliment is that I push people to think in a different way, and that people have valued that. And so that's something that I have wanted to put into practice, is in helping people who are becoming principals to think about leadership in a different way. And just to give you a backstory, when I was thinking about becoming a principal, I looked around at the principal I was working with at the time, and I thought I couldn't do the job like that. And what I realized was that I could do the job, but my style was going to be different than that person's. And I think everybody can do the job if they want to, and they're going to do it in a different way, knowing their best strengths and knowing where their blind spots are. And so that is what I'm trying, because I think too often educators say they pull off what's the trendiest, what's the current. We're going to do this now. We're going to implement it, or from the top down, they receive this, and we're all doing this. And I don't know that that's always the best thing. I don't think we should be switching, doing this and doing that and doing this and doing that. We have to stay the course, and we have to be sure we know what our beliefs are and what our vision is and how are we going to enact that. And so for me, having that kind of clarity about what I believe and how that's going to govern how I lead is huge. That came, not at the beginning of my career. It probably came, after being in it a quarter of my career, where I had this wonderful opportunity to really get clarity on what is my true north? What are my guiding beliefs and principles that are going to guide those decisions in how I lead a school? And I think that's really important for all potential school leaders, is to think about that, because that is the crux of your leadership. And that's the crux of being an authentic leader, I think, is leading from who you are. They always say you teach who you are. Well, you lead who you are as well.
So how do you make the distinction between areas where you should be different as a leader and kind of be authentic to yourself, and areas where you need to kind of follow, at least on some level, the outline or the path that maybe has gone before you? Because, if you're a beginning school leader, I could imagine maybe you're true north, maybe that's not really the best way to go. You know what I mean? Like maybe your gut is a little off because it hasn't really been trained to know what's right and wrong, or like what would be the healthiest thing for the students or for the school at that point, because you're just starting off. So, you're kind of mentioning that you figured that out probably a quarter into your career as a school leader. But how do you make that distinction? Like, these are areas that I can be authentic. Is that something that just kind of comes over time and through experience, or are there kind of really clear areas that it makes more sense to be that way than others?
Well, I think it's a process. So I think, I was clear about what I valued and what I believed in. But I think having a good mentor and I think initially, having a good mentor and learning from them, and then also observing and seeing and reflecting on the things that fit or resonated or didn't fit. So, so as you're becoming, from an assistant principal, let's say, to a principal, you're developing that stronger sense of how you would lead. As an assistant principal, I felt like, my job is to support the principal and his vision, although hopefully it's collaborative vision, depending on the person that you have that opportunity to work with. And so I think it's not that it happens like it's a switch or that it didn't happen in the beginning, but I think I was stronger in it later. I had an opportunity to train at the University of Pittsburgh in the Institute for Learning, and it was really there that I really had a stronger set or ideas of a framework for leading. And for me, that was really critical. Some people have that right away. Being who I am, I have a lot of interest in every new idea is a good one. And I love new ideas. I love trying new things. But that isn't always the best. So, having to really weigh each new idea against the direction, the vision, and what you've set up as a structure or a way of enacting that vision, I think is really important. That I didn't develop till later, but I kind of knew in my gut things that I valued or didn't value or who I wanted to be or not be as I observed different leaders enact their own vision. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think the big takeaway for me, because I've heard from many leaders who have just been in school leadership for a while, one of the suggestions that they have is to just kind of listen and learn early on and just be open to learning and not feeling as though you have all the answers day one, but just being willing to learn from those around you. And so, obviously it's important though to kind of, I'm the reason I asked that question is to help, I guess, figure out the balance between that versus I do think it's important to kind of be unique, be the kind of leader that you authentically should be and not try to model someone else. So it's kind of like, I feel like maybe there potentially could be some tension between, kind of learning from others, but then also being yourself. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And then also as an assistant principal working with the principal, you're developing a team. And my first experience with that, my principal and I were very much opposites. And, in terms of just that connection with people, he was much more an introvert, more intellectual, in terms of how he communicated, always articulate. And, but people would come to me, I think, as a way to communicate with him too, and so it was building that trust of balance. Like, here are your ideas. Here's what I'm hearing from other people. How do you communicate that to your boss? And yet I'm still learning from that person, and balancing what I hear from other people. And so it's just maintaining that open communication and having those dialogues so you can, weigh the different perspectives and formulate those opinions. And hopefully, if you're a part of a collaborative team, doing that together as well, compromising some and giving way to doing it a different way that you might not trust, but in the end, you learn from that too.
Yeah.
So
I think that's a key ingredient that you've mentioned a few times is just having that collaborative group, that group that you can bounce ideas off of. And hopefully there's some people in there that have more experience than you. And I'm sure it's kind of a mixed group, but it gives you an opportunity to have a sounding board instead of, I think that probably a lot of mistakes, new leaders make is they just kind of go off as, like we talked about earlier, kind of as if they're on an island and they have to call the shots and make all the decisions and they can't get any input from anybody else. And I think from kind of what you're saying is it's really healthy and super important to be effective as a leader, to kind of have that group of people that you can bounce ideas off of.
Right. Yeah, I think it's key. I can't imagine doing the job totally alone without having that.
Well, and so I'm curious, I had kind of read in your bio or a little information that I'd found about you that you have some experience as an author too. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah. So talk to us about that. What are some of the books that you've had a chance to be a part of?
Well, I've co-written 2 books with Jane Kesey on differentiated leadership and creating a coaching culture within PLCs. And both of those use the framework of type, which is the Myers-Briggs type indicator, right, of really looking at learning styles as a way of learning styles and personality type, basically as a way of doing the work in schools. And the way I grabbed onto that is, I first had Jane, this, who I would say is more of the expert, come and do a presentation when we were doing a career day, and had her introduce this concept to kids, and was really taken by that idea that jobs and choices that people make are really not only driven by interest, but personality. And then Jane and I did work in the suburban school and then the urban school about introducing type to teachers and then to students. And the idea is, how do you learn? How do you take in information, and how do you make decisions about it, which are the 2 key things that we do in schools. And I can say that from a nutshell, why I think it's so important is that, as I said earlier, we teach who we are. But if we only teach to students that are just like us, we're missing a majority of students. So the key is, why I love this framework, is understanding who you are and then teaching to your opposite. You encompass all learning styles. And as a leader, understanding type, it was a way to communicate with my staff. What I need to hear from my boss, for example, is different than what the person who has an opposite learning style or personality type needs to hear. And so understanding that is how you, transform your messages, how you listen and acknowledge differently, how you provide different professional development opportunities. All of that comes in to play. And so I found it a very useful tool and an easy one. I'm not the expert. Jane is definitely the expert. When I collaborated on the books, I talked about how it could be enacted in the schools. And that's what I did. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. It was interesting in visiting with Jane. She and I are both INFJs, which is, I think it's a really small percentage of the population. So to your point, if you just teach to people who are just like yourself, in my case, I think it's like 1% of the population. So I would be missing 99% of the other people out there if I was just trying to teach to my personality type.
Right. Yeah. And I'm ENFP. And so, I think that if I avoided my opposite, which was ISTJ, I would miss communicating with the majority of people. Oftentimes, a lot of people in secondary, the majority are of my opposite type. And, it's like I could move faster because I like new things. And my opposite wants to not move too fast unless you're totally sure of things. So, yeah, it was really critical. I had everybody take the Myers-Briggs in my school and self-report their finding. And I used that as a way when especially I had a critical message, is what do they need to hear? How can I say this in a way that they can hear my message? Because it's so easy to assume that people are hearing or understanding your communication in the same way as you're intending it. You have to change the message. And I can give you an example, Jay, of when that really happened as an assistant principal. again, technology was not at its best. So I was doing the schedule, and it was one of my first years, second year, doing the schedule. And we had, so about 1,000 kids, and we had all these independent courses, singletons, and we teamed. So we had to have teams together. We had all these things that constricted the schedule. Anyway, we would do a schedule run, and I would have to wait a week to get the results from the place that processed it. Well, that was not enough time. So then I ended up going up to this company almost daily after I would do a run, and then driving back and on. And the computer would shut down. We had individual schedule changes. I mean, it was just ad nauseum. I was there till midnight, many nights working on this, And so at the end of when we opened school, I met with the superintendent and my principal, and I said, "Oh my gosh, this was awful. This was so stressful, and it was so, it took time away from my family, and I had to do all these changes. I didn't have this. I did, and I was emoting because I'm a feeler, and I was talking about the impact, and it was just ridiculous." And the superintendent says to me, "Did you open school on time?" And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Were all kids in classes?" And he said, "Yep." And he said, "So what's the problem?" And I was so mad. I just thought, so the next year I kept track. I had a little sheet by my computer. Every time the computer went down, I wrote it down. Every time I made a run up to this place to get the results, I made it. Every schedule change I made to individualize, now we're individually scheduling 1,000 kids to make it work. Every time I did that, I kept data. Met with my superintendent and principal at the end of after we opened school, and I provided data to them. This is how many times this happened, this is what happened, and the superintendent was appalled and said, "Oh my gosh, this is a huge problem. Why didn't you tell me this?" And from there, we made changes in how we were doing and offering some of the classes. So it was the idea that data mattered to him. To me, I wasn't specific enough because I didn't need that. I knew how bad it was, but he did. In order for him to hear my concerns, I had to communicate it in a way that made sense to him.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful. Because so often, we talk how we would want to be talked to,
Yeah.
And then we don't realize that the other person really just doesn't hear us because they're speaking in some ways kind of a different language, right?
Right. And, I think that's one of the, things that I've learned by using type and working with Jane too, is that if people really understand that people's differences are really a strength and can help make you better if we really try to understand them, rather than labeling people as resistive to change, or sometimes I've heard people say, "Oh, well, they're just manipulators," or they're passive aggressive or whatever. But I don't believe that. I believe people operate based on their needs for either more information or acknowledgement, or that they haven't had the right communication in terms of truly understanding an issue. And you may still disagree, but at least you disagree and understand that it's a difference. It's not a deliberate way of trying to resist or undermine. And I think that's hard for people. I think that's hard for people to really understand that people operate based on their strengths and beliefs, and nobody wants to go to work and say, "Oh, I'm going to make it miserable for so-and-so today." People go, everybody wants to do the best job they want to do. And so how do we foster that kind of environment and foster those kind of conversations where people can really communicate? And I think type is a great tool for that. So yeah, the 2 books that we wrote, they were great. And I used them too in terms of managing a leadership team, because my strengths will help me lead, but my blind spots will get in the way. And if you have people with different strengths, they're going to see those blind spots and be able to counter that. And so if you have an open discussion about here's my weaknesses or my strengths and here's my need areas, and everybody is talking about that, then as a team, you're going to make better decisions because you're going to be looking at it from all different perspectives. And I found that to be very true.
Yeah, so I've been interested in Myers-Briggs and personality types for quite a while, since probably for the last 20 years or so. But for somebody who maybe is just new to this idea, what would be a good resource for them to learn more about it?
Well, I think depending on the role, I mean, there's a lot of books out there, but, I'm going to plug in Jane Kise, Kise's books. She's written over 25 books on this. From a leader, I think our book on differentiated leadership is a really easy one to begin understanding this. There is, I think a lot of people have taken the Myers-Briggs, but they haven't ever enacted it. And the books that Jane has written and that she and I have co-authored, we really try to put it in the perspective of education and enacting it in education. So it's not just coding and then going, oh, that's who I am, and go on with it. A lot of people have done this model of red, green, yellow, blue, which is based on the Myers-Briggs. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't go as deep as the Myers-Briggs, and that's why I like using that model. Sandra Hirsch has some books out. The Type Association has some books and pamphlets on using type in schools. So there's a lot of resources out there.
So quick plug in regard to your books. So what would be the biggest takeaway that you would hope an educator would gain from differentiated school leadership?
I think looking at different strengths and learning styles of people and how to use that to build a leadership team and lead your initiatives. How do you communicate about those? And how you have to use what you know of yourself and the other person really to lead people to enact the vision that you want in the school.
So what would be different, and then what would be the biggest takeaway for an educational leader creating a coaching culture for professional learning communities?
Well, I think the learning communities is really about the PLC work. I think that, the PLCs are across the board, all different. And I think that one of the main things people assume is that people know how to work together and know how to communicate. And I think that book really offers some tools for really understanding how you can communicate better with one another, understanding how people are going to take in information in a different way, and understanding basically that in order for a PLC to really thrive and sustain, you have to be aware of what those strengths and what those struggle areas might be. And that's when you'll go richer and deeper into that work, and I think have a bigger impact on student achievement.
That's great. I'll make sure to put in the show notes, I will put that in there so people can find both of those books. So great. I'm going to roll through some rapid fire questions if you're ready for those.
Okay.
First off, what would you say is the best leadership advice you've ever received?
I think it's find your true north.
Yeah, that's great advice. So what would you say, I guess, it has been your biggest strength as a school administrator?
I think being a creative thinker, thinking beyond the box. In fact, I just had a call from some staff that are trying to make a decision, and that's what they wanted from me. Just thinking of alternative ideas, alternative ways of approaching things.
So do you have a book or two that you would recommend for other school leaders that have made a big, I know we've talked about several books and of course the two wonderful books that you've had a chance to co-author, but in addition to those, have there been any others that have really made a big impact on you?
Yeah. Well, when I first got my first principal job, I think the book is called The First 180 Days. It's a business book, but it was really helpful in trying to think about those first days where you're making an impression. That was really helpful. I think the other book, Sonia Nieto's book, The Light in Their Eyes, I loved that book. And I think as being a leader, an anti-racist equity leader today is so critical, and there's so many books out there that are great about that. That was probably the first one that opened my eyes. But Anthony Muhammad's books, Shiraki Holly, he has techniques for teachers. The courageous conversations, the PEG work, it's been critical. But I would say, really, especially if you're in a white school, not just a really racially diverse school, understanding equity and how you can be that type of leader is key. So,
yeah, I had a chance to have both Shiraki Holly and Anthony Muhammad on this podcast. Great conversations.
Yeah.
Well, so what advice would you have for a school leader in regard to working with their students?
Well, I think you create your job. And one of the things I did is I created a space for student voice, which sometimes, depending on the school, teachers don't always want to hear. But I think, I created an opportunity for monthly where I got together with students to hear what their concerns were, what was going well, what questions they asked, what would they like to see differently. And as a result of those conversations, I made changes in my school. I did some different things or offered new things for students. And so that voice is really critical and a perspective that is often missing. They might be, part of a leadership team, but kind of, like one or two of them. But I probably met with, 120 to 150 students a month just to hear their voice. And then getting into classrooms, seeing kids and asking them when the teacher's not talking and they're doing independent work, what are you learning? Why are you learning it? What do you need to do next? Having those conversations to really understand how students are taking in that information and making sense of what they're learning in the classroom. And it's also, teachers love hearing that as well, the feedback from students.
Well, and so kind of along those lines, what piece of advice would you have for a school leader as far as working with the teachers?
Well, my big thing is always, continue to support teachers to be the best they can be. So I think providing those opportunities of, well, one, getting into their classroom and seeing what they're doing and offering feedback or observation notes, because teachers don't always know how things come across or what they did, or, they're in their moment. So getting in and letting them know you really value what's happening in the classroom, that's a good sign of doing that. And then offering professional development opportunities, whether that's through a book study or whether that's an article or whether that's questions that you're probing, but making sure that teachers are really continuing to learn and grow just as we're wanting kids to do. I think that is really critical and really important.
Yeah, I think more than one guest has said leaders are learners because, it's not some ivory tower that you arrive in and
right.
Then you can just kind of sit around and eat bonbons and goof off all the time. I mean, you have to keep learning if you want to keep being effective as a leader.
Absolutely.
Well, so last question I have, if you had a time machine and you could jump in it and go back to the point in time when you first made the decision to go into education, what advice would you go back and give to that younger version of yourself?
Gosh. Maybe in light of current things going on now, maybe be a little more politically active in terms of your own organization, educational association, and being involved in that way. At least being aware of decisions being made in your own state legislatively about education, being, just being more aware of that from the early on. Yeah, I think, and continuing to grow and learn and take advantage of all opportunities to do so. I was thinking about, because one of the questions you kind of front-loaded to think about was advice for someone who wants to do this. And I was thinking and it came out like 3 C's, but, really keeping current with what's going on is really important, and continuing to learn and reading things so you're understanding the profession, and not even just in education materials, but even business that you can learn from what's going on in the business world and how does that apply, and continuing to be creative and risk taker, not always doing the status quo, and then being caring. It really is all about the people you're working with and the people you're serving, which is the kids, is create that caring, supportive environment.
So what were those 3 C's again? I gotta get these down.
Being current, being creative, and being caring. Not necessarily in that order.
Oh, that's great advice. So last thing I have, if one of our listeners wants to reach out to you after the show, what would be the best way to connect with you?
Well, I am on Twitter, but you wouldn't find me probably. It's Lakes Minneapolis, Lakes MPLS. But my email, bethrsrussell@gmail.com.
I'll make sure to put that in the show notes so people can get a hold of you. EduLeaders, this has been a great interview today. For the show notes of today's show and other resources, visit educatorslead.com and type the word Beth into the search tool to find her show notes. Beth, thank you for sharing your journey with us today.
Well, thank you for having me on. This was fun, actually.
And that wraps up another episode of Educators Lead. This podcast is brought to you by Mometrics, the #1 test preparation company. Mometrics offers study materials for over 1,800 different exams, including the SAT, ACT, GED, end-of-course exams, state standard exams like the STAR, teacher certification exams, advanced placement, CLEP, ASVAB, GRE, and so many more. Mometrics takes the mountains of information students could be tested over for any given exam and boils it all down to just the fluff-free golden nuggets of information that are most likely to be on the exam. They couple that with some great study tips and test-taking strategies to help students maximize their test scores. With their interactive tutorial videos and a layout that makes lesson planning easy, Mometrics study guides, flashcards, and practice questions are a great fit for individual or classroom use. To learn more about our products and our vault of hundreds of free tutorial videos, please visit educatorslead.com/test prep. That's educatorslead.com/test prep. EduLeaders, thank you for joining us on Educators Lead. Visit us at educatorslead.com for everything we talked about today, free resources, and much, much more.